Welcome, everyone. It's great to see folks joining us today for this UERU Town Hall with Bryan Cook. As you know, I'm Steve Dandino, and I'm pleasure to serve as the Executive Director of the Association for Undergraduate Education at Research Universities, which we fondly abbreviate as UERU. Drop the A and emphasize the UERU, UERU. Great to see everyone joining us today. Just for those of you, I see some folks who are new to these kinds of town halls, so let me just share that it's a forum in which we'll hear from our guest. We will then open the floor up for questions, and we're hoping for a lot of dialogue today about this important topic. We would ask for you to, if you could, just take a moment to identify your university after your name. That's always helpful. If you could just change your name for that. And when it comes time for questions and answers, if you might, if we're a smaller group today, we might just raise our hands, either physically or using the electronic function to do so. That way we'll have a nice orderly Q&A with Dr. Cook. Again, welcome everyone to the UERU Town Hall with Bryan Cook from the Urban Institute. I'm Stephen Dandino, and on behalf of our 130 or so university members, we're just delighted folks are joining us for this vitally important topic today. In a moment, we'll get started. We're just giving people a chance to jump in after one or another meeting. Thank you for taking time for joining us. After the presentation, we'll have Q&A. This meeting, this town hall is recorded. I've already started the recording. And we'll edit the captioning and get it posted at the ueru.org website, where we keep all of these town halls and make them available to all our members, and we're looking forward to that. Well, without further ado, let me turn things over to the host for today's town hall. Julia Michaels joined UERU as the Director of UERU Development and Strategic Partnerships just last month. Delighted for her to be on board with our organization, and she is the host for today's town hall. Thanks so much, Julia.
All right, thanks, Steve, and thanks all of you for coming to this discussion. The topic is particularly important right now in light of the Boyer 2030 Commission report, as you all are familiar with, and its provocations around ensuring equitable access to higher education. Since the Supreme Court ruled last summer that the use of race as a factor in college admissions was unconstitutional, many universities have been taking a fresh look at their policies to comply with the new law while maintaining access. But we don't really have good data on what works, and that's a point that will come up repeatedly in this conversation today. So I wanted to start by collecting just a little bit of data from you and do a quick poll to see who considers their university affected by this Supreme Court decision. So I'm launching the poll now. And while that's running, I invite you to answer the question to the best of your knowledge. And I'll just say a few words about my esteemed colleague, Bryan Cook, who's our speaker today. So Bryan and I have worked together for a number of years while we were both at APLU, and I really can think of no better person to lead this conversation because he truly knows higher ed data inside and out, and he's launching a new project, which you'll hear about in a little bit. Bryan is now Director of Higher Education Policy at the Urban Institute Center on Education Data and Policy. He oversees Urban's higher education policy agenda, and he manages researchers who conduct analysis and develop analytical tools to inform and influence federal and state higher education policy. The Urban Institute is a highly regarded think tank that believes data and evidence are essential to shaping a more inclusive, equitable, and just society. You can learn more about them at urban.org. All right, looks like we have 87% participating in the poll. That may be as good as we're going to get, so I will just quickly share the results. Hopefully everyone can see them. All right, it looks like the majority are only somewhat affected, and there are some who don't know. Maybe that will turn to, you'll have a better sense of how it might affect you at the end of today's conversation. All right, without further ado, I will now hand the mic over to Dr. Bryan Cook. Bryan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Julia, and good afternoon or morning, depending on where you are logging in from. As Julia mentioned, I've been working in higher education policy for quite some time, over 20 years, and part of the portfolio of research I've done has been around issues of equity and diversity. And so not surprising, after the Supreme Court decision last year, one of the things that immediately came to mind for me and many others was, how exactly is this going to impact college admissions and equitable access going forward? And so that is sort of what led to the project that I want to share with you all today. This is a project that the idea for actually originated when I was working with Julia at APLU. And it started because there were a number of research publications that that came out and talked about the lack of racial diversity in enrollments, particularly at land grant universities, but in four-year colleges broadly. And one of the concerns I had with a lot of that research was that it primarily focused on the representation of students of color relative to the state population, which to some extent is one fair measure. But I think the challenge that I had with it from a research perspective was it didn't provide the full context and really didn't help identify potential solutions, largely because we didn't know anything about the demographics of the applicant pool. We didn't know anything about the demographics of the admit pool. And we didn't know then ultimately what the yield rate was from those. So part of the challenge being, if you've got a school whose applicant pool is, for example, 6% African American, and their admit pool is 7% African American, well, it may not look great on its own, but in the context of the applicant pool, they're actually doing pretty good, as opposed to a school whose applicant pool is 20% African American and their admit pool is 8% African American. That raises a very different type of question. And so without that information, we didn't really know where the issue existed. So this was an idea that came to me when I was at APLU, but never really got a chance to explore it any further. Once I got to Urban, sort of rekindled the idea of trying to collect this information, because as I'm sure most or all of you know, as much data is available in iPads, this is not one of the things that is measurable. Applicant, admit, enrollee data exists, but it's only disaggregated by gender, not by race, ethnicity, and not by income. And so we thought that it would be a good idea to see if we could work with a set of schools to begin to collect this type of information, just so we could get a sense of, when we talk about the challenges that arise around increasing racial and ethnic diversity among enrolled students, where are we seeing some of the challenges? Is it in the applicant pool? Is it in who ultimately gets admitted? Or, as some schools have claimed, is it in the yield rate, that they have a diverse applicant pool, they have a diverse admit pool, but then ultimately, students of color are choosing not to enroll there? And so that was the idea for this project. And we began planting the seeds for doing this work well before the Supreme Court decision. And so you fast forward to June of last year, and we get the decision. And now this project takes on a very different sort of context, because now it's not just a question around better understanding some of the challenges that may exist as it pertains to diversifying enrolled students, but now it's a question of, how does this change in use of race and admissions impact what the applicant pool looks like, what the admit pool looks like, and what the yield rate looks like? And as I mentioned, because this data does not exist in iPads, even if at some point, as I have been hearing for the past year or so now, that it will get added to iPads, the ability to track the impact doesn't exist because there's no historical data. So we only know what happens going forward. And so that was the other value of this particular project, was the ability to look back in time before the Supreme Court decision to better understand what the impact was, particularly in this first year. So the idea for this project, as it pertains to sort of the Supreme Court decision, really came into effect after a convening that Urban hosted 3 weeks after the Supreme Court decision, and it was actually the day after. If any of you familiar with the convening that the Department of Education hosted to talk about the implications of the Supreme Court decision, we actually had a convening that next day. And it was at that convening that we were able to meet with a number of academic researchers who were planning to do some sort of similar project to look at the implications of this decision on this first class that will be applying to college post affirmative action. And so in talking with these researchers, we came up with an idea of sort of working together to create this broader sort of project. And a lot of what I'm going to share with you in terms of the specifics really pertains to sort of what we envision as being sort of the first year of this project, because we think of this as a multi-year project. The first year is really focused on simply understanding how did the Supreme Court decision impact this first class, particularly as it pertains to the demographics of who applies, who admits, and who enrolls. But ultimately, we would love to see this evolve into some sort of admissions observatory where we're doing a complete body of work that really starts to explore college admissions in sort of this post-affirmative action world. And so whether that means working with specific institutions, whether it's working with a collection of institutions, but collecting or securing funding for a number of different projects, diverse projects, and really just housing this comprehensive body that's going to look at this issue from a number of different perspectives. So let me give you a little bit of overview of the project itself. So there are three main components to this project. There's the collection of data on applicants, admits, and enrollees. There's the collection of data on changes to admissions policies and practices. And then, pending enough available funding, we're planning to host a convening of all the participating schools to not only present the findings, but then to have a discussion around their implications. So first, I'll talk a little bit about the data collection on applicants, admits, and enrollees. So we're looking to collect this data in aggregate form, so not student level data. And this is largely because we're trying to make this as simple for schools as possible. And we understand that, particularly given all the dynamics around diversity these days, that collecting student level data could be a very sensitive issue. So not looking to collect any student level data, aggregate level data only. As I mentioned, because we want to be able to track change relative to the Supreme Court decision, we'd be looking to collect 7 years of data. So starting with the 2018-19 academic year, going through 2024-2025. We initially considered 5 years of data, but that puts us squarely in the middle of COVID. And so we had to make a decision of, do we start after COVID, when a lot of schools had switched to sort of test optional policies, or do we want pre-COVID, where we get a better picture of what sort of a normal admission cycle looks like? So that is what led us to starting in the 2018-19 year. The data that so there are 10 measures that we're looking to collect, all of which would be disaggregated by race. So we're looking at whether or not students took an AP or IB course. We're looking at high school GPA, SAT, ACT scores, parent or household income, whether or not they're a Pell recipient, whether or not they had legacy status, whether or not they were a recruited athlete, and then 2 additional ones that depending on the level of burden of these other items may or may not be included in this first year of data collection: transfer status and gender. So so those are the sort of 10 variables that we've sort of identified as being key to having some sense of how admissions and applicants and admits have changed as a result of the Supreme Court decision. From a timeline perspective, we would look to begin collecting the 2018-19 and through 2023-24 applicant, admit, and enrollee data probably in the late spring, early summer period, with schools having a fair amount of time to get that data in. So it's not like there'd be like a 2-week window or anything like that. We'd start collecting late spring, early summer, and as schools can get the data ready, we would happily accept it. We'd also expect to probably be able to get during that time applicant and admit data for 2024, 2025, as most schools will probably have most of that data. The enrollee data for 2024, 2025 is a little more of an unknown, particularly given some of the issues that we're having with FAFSA right now. And so we would expect that probably would not be available until probably sometime closer to the fall, depending on the schools. And so, but that's something that I would love to get feedback from this group on, in terms of, what would seem like a realistic time period for getting enrollment data for this current class. So that's sort of the data collection for the applicant, admits, and enrollees. The data collection on admissions policies and practices would be done via a survey. We're working with the National Association for College Admissions Counseling, NACAC, who, as many of you may know, used to do an annual state of college admissions survey. They actually paused that survey during the pandemic and are actually in the process of sort of revisioning, what that survey looks like, moving it probably from an annual survey, and also trying to get as much administrative data as they can to minimize the burden to schools. So as part of that revisioning, they've agreed to work with us to develop a survey that would likely go out sometime in the summer. And the focus of that survey would be to collect data on how schools have changed their admissions policies and practices over the past several years. So not just in response to the Supreme Court decision, but what changes have they been making over the past several years? And we believe that this is important context for the data that we collect on applicants, admits, and enrollees. Because if we see schools whose demographics of those groups have not changed, what's important to know is that a result of policy changes that they've made in their admissions practices, or is it that they simply weren't impacted by the ruling in terms of who chose to apply to their institutions? So having some sense of any changes to admissions policies and practices is important to contextualize the data that we get on applicants, admits, and enrollees. And then the last piece of the project, again, would be this national convening. And again, it would be pending our ability to get all the funding that we've been requesting. But sometime in the late fall, Urban would host a convening of representatives from all the participating schools to discuss the findings as well as their implications. We would include in this convening representatives from Education Council. And I'm not sure if all of you are familiar with Education Council, but they've been essentially the leading voice on the legal side of the Supreme Court decision. And we would have them participate in the convening to provide updates on the legal status of admissions policies a year later, a year after the Supreme Court decision. And then we would also invite other national studies on this issue to present their findings at this convening as well. So it wouldn't just be us presenting what we have found from our research, but I know that there's work that the College Board is doing with their Admissions Research Consortium. I expect that the National Student Clearinghouse and Common App are going to be doing something that will look at this. And so what we would be putting together would be a fairly comprehensive presentation of findings of this first year of admissions in a post-affirmative action world. And so just to give you and sort of update on where things stand with this project. So we've been talking with Kresge Foundation, who has really been supportive of this project and has invited us to submit a proposal that will essentially cover all the research components of the project. So we fully expect to secure that funding, and so the research piece is pretty secure. We've been talking with other funders such as Lumina, Gates, and Ascendium to get the additional funding that would cover the convening and some potential follow-up work in the first year. We've also secured verbal commitments of support to promote this project among their membership from APLU, as well as the University Innovation Alliance, UIA, and AAU is also taking the idea to their board for approval because they're supportive of the project and they're looking to get sign off to support it as well. Additionally, the Association for Institutional Research, the association that represents institutional researchers, as well as NACAC, have also agreed to promote the project within their membership. And ultimately, we're hoping to get at least 50 schools to participate so that we can actually say something meaningful. And so, so I was excited when, well, it was bittersweet when Julia announced her departure from APLU to UERU. But I also saw it as an opportunity because this is a group that really seems primed to be supportive of a project like this. And the value of sort of the groups that we've pulled together is to have a group who either oversees enrollment management or has traditionally been involved with enrollment management, along with groups like AAU and APLU that represent the presidents, AIR, which represents the institutional researchers who would likely be pulling this data to submit, and admissions counselors who would likely be filling out the survey around admissions policies. We've hit all those national organizations to not only help secure participation, but to also give us guidance on ways to ensure the work that we're doing minimizes the burden to schools. So for example, a lot of the data elements that we've talked about collecting in the aggregate, I've submitted to AIR to review, to help me understand, would this be burdensome? Is this doable across most schools? Are there things that we could change to make it easier? And so I think we've done a pretty good job of trying to develop a project that will help inform this very important national conversation in a way that minimizes as much as possible the burden to schools to provide this information. We would not be disclosing any schools who participate, so everyone would be anonymous. Obviously, there would be no analysis of schools at the individual level other than in reports that we would provide back to participating schools that would show their data relative to all the participating schools, and then to the extent possible, peer institutions, regional, other regional other schools in their region, and so on. So, but beyond that, all analysis would be done only in the aggregate. And so I think that's pretty much the overview of the project, and I'm certainly happy to answer any questions or entertain any comments. But really, this was for me an opportunity to get in front of some of the UERU members and really just make a plea for considering participation in this important project. Again, having APLU and AAU on board, I think helps in terms of making presidents aware of the project and potentially getting them motivated as well. But I really see this group as really being foundational to getting schools to participate. So I appreciate Steve and Julia giving me the opportunity to talk to you today about this project of ours.
Thank you so much, Bryan. And we'll turn it over to questions, comments, and discussion, both about the project and then the broader topic of race and admissions as well. Would anyone like to start? Well, I can ask a question, Bryan.
I think we've
You got one?
Yeah, Hillary.
Hillary, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. Bryan, thanks so much for sharing this. I'm just processing everything that you said, and I apologize that I joined a few minutes late. Did you say when official calls will go out, or what's the timeline to start this?
Yeah, so I there's no real official timeline. I mean, at this point, we would love to just start collecting a list of schools who are interested. So who are even simply interested in participating. And what I would envision is that probably sometime in mid-spring, we would take those who have identified to that point an interest in participating and host some sort of webinar to bring everyone together to sort of talk about sort of where we are and what would be required to sort of go forward. But at this point, just schools who are interested, just to help give us a sense of the breadth of interest, is what we would be looking for right now.
Okay, that's helpful. And then because you mentioned getting, enrollment data for fall 24, just as a sort of benchmark, this week we got our 12th, we got our census sort of information for this semester. So, I mean, at least 6 weeks and 2 months, to get official data, kind of, it would be, halfway into the fall semester at least.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we're sort of anticipating. And so even if we don't have enrollment data for a lot of schools, we figure that at least by this fall, we'll have some sense of applicant and admit data and how much that has changed. And we would have some preliminary enrollment data, but nothing final until we would get it in from all participating schools.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Hello. I'm just going to jump in. I don't see the hand raised here in Zoom. I'm a little Zoom challenged. But Bryan, thanks so much for your presentation today. It does sound like a very exciting opportunity. I was so glad to hear that you, as an institutional research practitioner, I'm so happy to hear that you reached out to AIR regarding data elements and the potential burden of reporting. When do you expect to have a response back from AIR, or have you already received it?
I've actually already received it. So I'm actually fortunate to have worked with and known Christine Keller, who's the executive director for AIR, for a number of years. Actually, probably closer to 20 years I've known Christine. And so when we first put together the list of proposed variables, I reached out to her and asked if she would share them with her board to give me some preliminary feedback. And so we received that several months ago. And even beyond that, there are a couple of specific members of AIR who I really respect a lot of the work that they do and their sort of connection across the wide array of sectors represented in AIR. And so I'm actually going to follow back up with a couple of those individuals to work more intimately on the finalization of the variables to ensure that what we put out and the way in which we're asking for the data is something that is doable across all types of schools, those with well-resourced IR offices and those that are less resourced. Because again, having worked in this space for quite some time, I recognize and respect the challenges around burden. And so we're trying to do this in a way that both ensures the quality of the research, but minimizes the burden on schools and specifically IR offices.
That sounds awesome. I do have another question for you. I believe you mentioned 50 institutions. You're hoping for 50. Is that a cap or is that a minimum or something else?
Oh, that's a minimum. If we
Okay.
as much of a challenge as getting say 100+ schools would be, that's a challenge we would gladly accept.
Okay. Thank you.
Bryan, what's the process by which universities should let you know if they're interested in participating in this project?
So I would say right now, and we have not discussed this, but I would probably say it would be easiest for them to let you all know, to alert you all that they're interested in this project, and you could share that information with us, because as I mentioned, I would love for UERU to serve as sort of the entry point for this project. Of course, as I mentioned, we're expecting AAU and APLU to send out notifications to presidents. But if presidents reach out to me about participation, and they happen to be UERU members, I would have them direct the request to whoever the UERU rep is for that school, and let them know that this is sort of where the official tracking of participants is taking place. One other thing I would add, I was I guess sort of, I don't know if pleased is the right word, but looking at the results of the polling, that everyone indicated that they were somewhat impacted by the decision, because it's when you talk to representatives from school across a number of sectors, there does tend to be this sense that this is something that really is a challenge for the more selective schools, and less of a challenge for moderately to low selective schools. And one of the things that we've learned from prior research on this issue, particularly as it pertains to the states that have already banned the use of race in admissions, and specifically in California, is that there is a cascading effect that occurs when you eliminate the use of race in admissions. And what I mean by that is, in California, Berkeley and UCLA saw a decline in the number of students of color who apply to the institutions, while schools like UC Davis and others saw an increase, because those students were making a choice not to apply to the more selective institutions, and apply to those that they felt maybe they had a better chance of getting into. And we suspect that could be playing out on a national level. And so part of this study, again, is not looking just at selective institutions. We want a range of institutions that participate. One of the groups in particular that we're going to be encouraging to participate are HBCUs, because there's this expectation that they could see an uptick in applications from African American students as a result of this. And so this project is really about having a full understanding across a breadth of institutions of how the Supreme Court decision may have impacted what applicants and admits look like at particular schools. I see the question about the undergraduate, graduate, and professional inclusion in the survey. So this survey is going to focus exclusively on undergraduate admission. So we're not going to get into graduate and professional work. That is something that we would want to look at in follow-up years. And in fact, there's another center within urban, or Center on Health Policy, that was actually looking at doing a project around the implications of healthcare for medical schools as a result of this decision. So there's some other work at Urban that is currently looking at the graduate level implications, but that's something we would probably take on in subsequent years.
I thought Judson had their hand up. Do you still have a question?
It was answered. My question was if there was going to be a focus on HBCUs in this project, but I appreciate that.
Wonderful.
One thing I have a question for this group, particularly given some of the states that I see represented. I'm wondering if there are any concerns given state politics about participating in a project like this, because that was one of the concerns that I had when we first embarked on this was, one bigger concern beyond the Supreme Court decision was whether or not there would be this movement in states to even stop collecting race data, which means we would know absolutely nothing about issues of equity. But we haven't quite gotten there yet. But wanting to hear from schools who could be influenced to some extent by state policies about a study like this. Jessica, would be happy to hear.
You said state, and I'm right in there. So I thank you so much, Bryan. It's exciting to hear about this project, and especially the way that, it will be using data that can tell a story, but it also can tell us pieces of an untold story. Your example of Davis is a really good one. I was in California in the 90s, and I do recall that untold story of choice, from the very beginning that doesn't get told in the numbers. So I really appreciate that you're paying a lot of attention to that. So in Texas right now, our current state is that we can still talk about issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion in our research. That is very clear in the law. It says this is nothing to do with research. It has nothing to do with teaching. The real issue I think that could potentially come up for institutions in Texas, and now I think this is very different from Florida, which will have a different answer for you, but in Texas, the institution's legal counsel, the way that they've interpreted the law and the way that they've decided to react, or the way that the leadership has decided to react, starts to sweep in other areas. So you may have heard that there was a speaker canceled at one of our institutions, and there's a question about whether that speaker fell under the law or didn't fall under the law. So that's where I think in that murky area, because the wording of the law it hasn't been tested yet, right? So we haven't seen lawsuits go up against it. So we don't have the full kind of interpretation of exactly how it's going to be applied. And that puts everybody in a precarious state. So that could potentially, I think you're right to notice that as a possible barrier for some people.
Yeah, one of the groups I had intended to reach out to, but haven't fully decided whether or not to do that is NACAC, which is the National Association of College and University Attorneys, to make them aware of this project and to get a sense from the national organization as to whether or not there should be any concerns at state levels about participating in a project like this. Now, to your point, Jessica, which is completely valid, every school's legal counsel is going to have a different interpretation of what that means and what their schools can and can't do. As we saw right after the Supreme Court decision, some schools looked solely at the letter of the decision, and others took that as a broad, sweeping, opportunity to do away with a lot of areas in which race and ethnicity is incorporated. And so So there's nothing that can be done about sort of the institutional level interpretation of laws. But I think even if we got from a national organization that there is nothing currently in statute at the state level that would prohibit a school from participating, then at least we can share that information, and then individual schools can obviously make their choice.
I have one question for you, Bryan. So some schools may ultimately choose not to participate for whatever reason. It could be because of the state issues around DEI, but how might universities in general, and this includes, this audience is mostly vice provosts for undergraduate education and those who are really invested in undergraduate affairs. How might universities in general think proactively about data collection as they prepare to test new policies and practices around admissions?
Well, I mean, the big thing is going to be understanding the implications of any policy changes and how they interact with each other, as it relates to increasing student diversity. When the decision first came down, a lot of the media requests and interviews that I fielded, we're talking about, so what are the options for schools, and do percent plans work, and and what about using socioeconomic status as a new indicator. And the reality is both the actual research on what happened in the states where race was banned, as well as research that has modeled the impact of different policies, has found two things. One, there's no single solution to addressing the issue of increasing diversity when race is not considered. So anything that results in an increase is probably going to be a multi-pronged approach. So it's probably going to be some combination of a number of different efforts that involve recruiting and changes in admissions policies and all of that. The other thing that the research and modeling has found is that even in combination, there's nothing that will replace race in terms of the ability to ensure certain levels of racial diversity. So as schools start to implement different policies and practices, there really needs to be an analytical understanding of how those things interplay with each other, because sometimes you'll get a school that may try a policy or practice that doesn't net certain results, and they'll disband it and say it's not working. Well, is it because it's the only thing that you tried? Or they may try 5 things and something works, and they'll drop one piece of that they think may be controversial, but it may be that it was the 5 things together that got you the result. And so having effective research to understand how these things are working together, I think will help schools better identify, given their location in the state, in the region, and the diversity of students that they typically draw from, what things are effective. And that's one of the things that we're hoping to do in the subsequent years of this study, is working with some of the schools that participate who want to delve further into this issue, to start exploring, well, what are some of the practices that you're implementing, and how effective are they? So we can begin to start to target what are the things that are working, and what things could you potentially, let go if you wanted to, and not impact the success you've had with diversity. Looks
I'll
like
ask Steve's question in the chat if anyone else wants to chime in from a state other than Texas.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Steve said there's someone there from Ohio, born and raised in Ohio. So
I should have put in the chat, Bryan, Colorado, because that's where UERU is located, and at Colorado State University. And I was just thinking about this whole concept, this whole project and issue from the point of view of the equity excellence imperative, that idea that the Boyer 2030 Commission advanced a few years ago now, and that people are kind of using to frame some of their thinking around these issues. It's not a brand new concept, obviously. It's this kind of democracy, put in a different way, higher education in a democracy. And I'm wondering if people, you or anyone else in this town hall, have a perspective on what they're seeing on the ground on their campuses when it comes to these issues. Because, I feel like we're in this, there's a lot of change happening, and a lot of it's concerning, to say the least, And I'm wondering how higher ed leaders and are, sort of trying to lead among themselves, on their campuses to advance ways of thinking and strategies, and in this case, data collection and, participating with others in a collaborative and solidaristic way to learn and bolster our understanding as we kind of head into what looks like could be a very, very challenging period for higher education for our country, and in other countries as well around the world. And I'm just kind of open up to, like, I'm not sure quite where the Urban Institute, what role y'all can play or do play in these. I think it's through maintaining a high degree of integrity in your research. But maybe could you speak to sort of your sense of the larger landscape and where this study might lead us if we got behind it in the way that you're inviting us to do, very generously, I might add, and kindly. Like what might we, working together, the meandering question, but what might we working together, aspire to achieve, and what kind of impact might we feel broadly as we face this historical situation?
Yeah, I mean, so Urban is one of the remaining few nonpartisan, non-advocacy think tanks. So we don't lobby on behalf of any particular legislation. We're not left-leaning or right-leaning, even though we're often portrayed as left-leaning. We are not. We're an organization that really promotes the use of data and relies on what data tells us, and using data to inform decisions, whatever those decisions may be. That has, as you laid out, Steve, in the political environment in which we find ourselves, that's an increasingly challenging position to be in, because there's a lot of confidence that's been lost in data. Facts are no longer facts as we used to know them. They've largely been weaponized, and so it is a challenging place to sort of be, particularly in the context of higher education being viewed in a way that I don't know that I've ever seen in my life, in terms of sort of the negative perceptions that people have about higher education, whether it's affordability, whether it's around cultural issues, whatever it is, whether it's left or right, somebody's got a bone to pick with higher education. And I think at Urban, because Urban, unlike organizations like membership associations like the APLUs and the ACEs or the Us or others, who really are about sort of the promotion of higher education and the good that it serves and the good that it can do. Urban is really more focused on the larger societal outcomes, and in that context, we still see value in higher education. Now, the level of value varies across sectors and credential types and all kinds of things. That is, we could go down a deep rabbit hole with that. But I think in this context, for this study, one of the important things is about ensuring equitable access for all who want to pursue a post-secondary credential, and not just at the 2-year level, but at the 4-year level. And the concern is that what the Supreme Court decision has done is, for a certain group of students, it may it may make them think twice about either applying to a four-year school or applying to a certain type of four-year school. And the goal of this study, of this project, is to identify exactly what the implications of the decision are. So that we are operating from a fact-based perspective. If in fact we don't see much change in diversity, doesn't mean that the decision wasn't still impactful, but at least in this first year, we're not seeing that. And we need to understand why. Is it because of policies and practices that schools put in place in the past year or in the years prior, anticipating this outcome? Or is it that for many students who apply, like they haven't even really thought about this and they still just apply where they apply? Like we need to understand what happens and why it happened to have a better sense of how we go forward with admissions in general. And to be perfectly blunt, one of the things that has come out of all this is, for a lot of schools, it's not like they were achieving peak equitable admissions to begin with. And so to some extent, the Band-Aid that was affirmative action has been ripped off. So the question becomes now, what do we replace it with? And so that's, one of the longer term outcomes of a project like this is if you think beyond just the first year of data collection and understanding the immediate implications, what are the long-term implications? How can we fundamentally change the way admissions works so that it is more equitable? Not just across race, but race, income, and a number of other variables. And ultimately that, and it's not just about access, it's also about success and completion. So that's a whole another piece of this. But so the long-winded answer to your question, Steve, is I think the role that urban and this project plays in some small way, focuses on the equitable access piece to higher education and understanding what the Supreme Court decision has done from a fact-based perspective so that we can then kind of move forward. Because the past year has been full of anecdotes of what's going to happen. But we don't know. We know what's happened in the states where affirmative action was banned, but those states vary significantly. Texas, California, Michigan, Oregon, like those are all very different states. And so this is the first time it has been a national ban. We need to understand the implications of that so we can better understand how we can revise admissions going forward.
I agree with you 100%. And I asked a long-winded question, so you get to do a long-winded answer. But I disagree with one thing. You said, well, it's a small step or I don't know. This feels really big to me. This feels like a really important opportunity for us to do everything you just said, to put on, to get the facts right, to understand exactly what's happening, not to assume, to see it from a national point of view, and to prepare ourselves with that data, with that analysis for just what you ended on, which was the opportunity for real structural change that goes beyond what we've seen before, to achieve our goals in a more robust, meaningful way all across the sector. And just UERU members educate somewhere over 3 million undergraduate students. And we know that there are the kinds of students who go on to roles of leadership in professions and communities, in society, in all kinds of ways. And so even though maybe there oughtn't be those kind of inequities among different institutional types, there are often, and we've got to pay attention to these particularly important millions of students who are going to have such influence on our society in its future. So the only thing I disagree with is I think it's super important, super duper important, has great strategic significance. And we'll do everything we can to further explore this with you and be a good partner. I'm sure the folks on this call, lots of others too, who couldn't join us just for this past hour.
Yeah, I certainly appreciate that. And anything you all can do to spread the word about this project, Vicki, I appreciate you, referencing sort of the tribal colleges in this. That's another group that we want to reach out to, again, because we want to understand the impact of this, and it's not just on selective institutions. every set of colleges and universities could potentially feel this in some way, shape, or form. And I think it's important that we get at least some snapshot of what that looks like, so we can best figure out what a response to future admissions policies and practices might look like.
Thank you so much, Bryan, for being here. I really appreciate your time today. This is an exciting project. I hope those who are on this call today will consider participating. And again, as Bryan indicated, just let UERU know if you're interested. You can do so in the My UERU platform. We've got a robust community there of discussion on these town halls. So we will definitely do that. This will be posted on the website, very soon, I think. So if someone from your campus wanted to watch and they had to miss it today, they'll be able to watch the recording. I will go ahead and thank you, Steve, for putting your email in the chat as well. Some of you may not have Steve's email, so it's good to put it there. All right. Thank you so much, Bryan. Please, everyone join me in thanking Bryan, and I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks, Bryan.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Bryan.